She handed me back the envelope without opening it. "Dad," she said, "I already know what's in it. I packed a bag this morning." I had to sit down. I hadn't planned for that part. "My name is Robert Callahan. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working as a site supervisor for a mid-sized construction company outside of Barrie, Ontario. I have rough hands, a bad knee from a fall-off scaffolding in 2004, and one daughter named Megan who is, without question, the best thing I have ever built. I raised Megan mostly on my own. Her mother, Patricia, passed away from an aggressive form of ovarian cancer when Megan was 11 years old. I won't spend long on that. I will only say that Patricia was the kind of woman who made every room feel warmer just by walking into it, and that after she was gone, Megan and I figured out together how to keep the heat on. We were close. Not in a suffocating way. Megan was always independent, stubborn in the best possible sense, the kind of girl who figured things out herself before she'd ever ask for help. But we were close, the way two people are close when they've been through something and come out the other side still standing. Sunday dinners, phone calls on the drive home from work. She'd text me pictures of things she thought were funny. I still have those texts going back years on my phone. I don't delete them. She met Brandon Kowalczyk at 26. He was 30 at the time, worked in finance, wore the kind of clothes that told you he wanted you to notice he wore nice clothes. I didn't dislike him immediately. That would be unfair to say. He was charming enough at first, shook my hand firmly, asked me questions about construction like he genuinely wanted to know, laughed at my jokes. He had the social skills of someone who had learned social skills deliberately, which is different from someone who just has them. But I told myself I was being too hard on him. Megan was happy. That was what mattered. They got married in September 2016. Small ceremony at a vineyard outside Collingwood. Megan wore a dress that Patricia would have helped her pick out, and I walked her down the aisle, trying very hard not to cry in front of 40 people and mostly failing. It was a good day. I want to be honest about that. Whatever came later, that day was real, and it was good. Their son, Noah, was born in April 2018. Then their daughter, Claire, in November 2020. I want to tell you about Noah and Claire before I tell you anything else, because they are the reason any of this matters. Noah is 6, now 7, in the spring. He has Patricia's eyes, this pale gray-green that looks different depending on the light. He is obsessed with dinosaurs and weather systems, and will explain both to you at significant length if you give him the opportunity, which I always do. Claire is 4. She has Megan's stubbornness and my loud laugh, and she calls me Grandpa Bob even though I told her she could just call me Grandpa. And she looked at me very seriously and said, "But you're Bob," and honestly she had a point. I lived 40 minutes away in Barrie. Close enough to be present, far enough to not be underfoot, or so I thought. The first sign was small, and I almost missed it entirely. It was Christmas 2021. I had driven down on the 23rd, arms full of presents, looking forward to 2 days with my grandchildren and my daughter. Megan opened the door, and there was something in her face, not unhappiness exactly, but a kind of held-breath look, like she was monitoring the room temperature. Brandon came in from the kitchen, shook my hand, said it was good to see me. Normal enough. But later, when I was sitting on the floor with Noah, doing a puzzle, and Claire was asleep on my leg, I heard Brandon in the kitchen saying to Megan, in a low voice, "You told him he could stay both nights?" Megan said something I couldn't hear. Brandon said, "It's just a lot of disruption to the routine." I pretended I hadn't heard. I told myself it was his house, and he was allowed to have preferences. I stayed one night instead of 2 and drove home on Christmas Eve telling myself it was fine. It wasn't fine. But I wasn't ready to know that yet. Through 2022, the visits got more complicated. Brandon started being present in a way that felt supervisory. If I took the kids to the backyard, he'd appear in the doorway. If I sat down with Megan for coffee while the kids played, he'd find a reason to join and redirect the conversation. When I suggested taking Noah to a Leafs game, just the 2 of us, a grandfather-grandson thing, Brandon said Noah had hockey practice that weekend. The next weekend, Noah had a birthday party. The weekend after that, Megan said Brandon thought Noah was coming down with something, and it was better not to overload him. I asked Megan directly. Once, in the spring of 2022, we were on the phone and I said, "Is everything okay? I feel like I'm not getting as much time with the kids." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Brandon just thinks it's important to keep a consistent schedule. It's not personal, Dad. She said it the way people say things they've rehearsed. Not like she believed it. Like she was hoping if she said it clearly enough, she would. I let it go. I shouldn't have, but I let it go. The summer of 2022 was the first time I drove the 40 minutes to their house and was asked to leave. Not harshly. Brandon answered the door and said Megan was tired, and they were keeping things quiet, and maybe I should have called ahead. I pointed out that I had called ahead that morning. He said he must have forgotten to pass that along to Megan. He smiled the whole time. That was the thing about Brandon, he was always smiling. It was like a mechanism. A door that stayed shut with a friendly sign on it. I drove home. I sat in my driveway for a while before going inside. I called my buddy Ray, who I've known since we were teenagers. Ray has the useful quality of saying plainly what you're not letting yourself say. I told him what had been happening over the past year or so, and Ray listened without interrupting. And when I was done, he said, "Bob, he's isolating her, and he's cutting you off in the process." I said I didn't want to assume the worst. Ray said, "I know you don't. That's why I'm assuming it for you." I still wasn't ready to do anything yet, but I started paying attention differently. By the fall of 2022, I was getting to see Noah and Claire roughly once a month, sometimes less, always on Brandon's schedule, always with Brandon present. Megan rarely called me on her own anymore. Most of our contact came through planned visits that Brandon arranged, and could just as easily unarrange with a text an hour before I was supposed to arrive. Twice I showed up to an empty driveway. Once I sat outside their house for 20 minutes before Megan came out and said something had come up and she was sorry. Her eyes not quite meeting mine. I was losing my daughter, and my grandchildren were growing up with a grandfather who appeared and disappeared like weather. There and gone. No consistency, no roots. Then came March 2023. I remember the date because I'd been planning the visit for 2 weeks. Noah had just learned to skate, really skate, not just shuffle along the boards, and Megan had sent me a video of him doing a lap on his own, and I had watched it 6 times in a row. I wanted to take him to the outdoor rink in their neighborhood, just the 2 of us, and get a hot chocolate after. I had texted Megan. She had said yes. I had circled it in my head like something to look forward to. I was backing out of my driveway at 8 in the morning when my phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't recognize. I pulled back into the garage and read it. Mr. Callahan. I think it's time we had an honest conversation about boundaries and expectations. Megan and I have discussed this, and we're in agreement. If you want to maintain regular visits with Noah and Claire going forward, we're going to need to formalize the arrangement. We're thinking $2,500 a month, paid in advance, to cover the additional costs and disruption that your visits create. This is a reasonable ask given everything. Please confirm by end of week. Brandon. I read it 3 times. I put my phone down on the passenger seat. I sat in my garage for a long time. $2,500 a month. To see my grandchildren. My daughter had apparently agreed to this. The children I had held in the delivery room, whose first words I had heard, whose drawings were magneted to my refrigerator, I would need to pay a monthly fee to be in their lives. My first feeling was not anger. My first feeling was something closer to grief, because I understood in that moment that whatever was happening in that house had gone much further than I had let myself believe, and that Megan was in it much deeper than I had wanted to see. Then the anger came. I didn't reply. I put the phone back in my pocket and drove to my daughter's house. Brandon answered the door. He was in his weekend clothes, pressed jeans, a quarter zip, still smiling. I said, "I'd like to talk to you and Megan, together." Inside, he said, "Did you get my text?" I said, "I'd like to talk inside." He stepped back and let me in. Megan was in the kitchen. She looked at me and then looked away. And in that 1 second, I saw everything, the embarrassment, the anxiety, the particular kind of exhausted shame that comes from knowing something is wrong and not knowing how to stop it. Noah came sliding down the hallway in his socks. "Grandpa Bob!" He crashed into my legs. I held on to him for a second longer than usual. Claire yelled from upstairs that she was coming. She was just getting her stuffed rabbit. Brandon said, "Kids, go play in the basement for a few minutes." The basement door closed. We stood in the kitchen, the 3 of us. I looked at my daughter. I said, "Did you agree to this?" She didn't answer right away. Brandon said, "We talked about it, and we both feel." I held up one hand. I'm asking Megan. Megan stared at the countertop. She said, very quietly, Brandon thought it would help establish some structure. I said, Megan, did you agree to charge me money to see your children? She looked up at me then, and I saw it the way she'd been phrased into this, the way this decision had been arrived at through repetition and exhaustion and pressure until she couldn't see it clearly anymore. She looked like a person who had been in a dim room for so long they'd forgotten what sunlight looked like. She said, Dad, and then she stopped. Brandon said, It's not personal, Robert. It's about establishing healthy boundaries around family visits. I looked at him. I kept my voice level because my voice being level was the most useful thing I could do in that moment. I said, Brandon, I'm going to need you to give Megan and me 5 minutes alone. He said, I don't think that's 5 minutes. Something in my voice or my size, I'm not a small man, made him decide it was easier to agree. He went into the living room. I could see his shadow in the doorway. I sat down at the kitchen table. Megan sat across from me. I said, quietly, I need you to hear me and not him right now. Can you do that? She nodded, barely. I said, I'm not angry at you. I want you to know that before I say anything else, I'm not angry at you. Her jaw tightened. The way it does when you're trying not to cry. I said, but I'm not paying $2,500 a month to see my grandchildren. And I think somewhere underneath all of this, you know why that is not because of the money, but because of what it means and what it would start. She was quiet. I said, I love you. I loved your mother. I will never stop being your father, and I am not going anywhere. I stood up, but I'm also not going to pretend this is normal. I have some things I need to take care of, and then we're going to figure this out properly. I got up. I called down to the basement that I'd see the kids soon. Noah yelled something about showing me a dinosaur book next time. Claire yelled about her rabbit. I left. I want to be honest about the next few weeks. They were not easy weeks. I drove back to Barrie, and I sat with what I knew, and what I knew was this. I had a son-in-law who had systematically restricted my access to my grandchildren, had now moved to a financial demand to formalize that restriction, and had done all of this while my daughter isolated from me, from her friends, from the version of herself she'd been before she married him, had been slowly pressed into going along with it. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a personality clash. This was a pattern. I called Ray. Ray listened, and then said, What are you going to do? I said, I'm going to be very careful and very thorough. The first call I made was to a family lawyer in Barrie named Margaret Osei. I had been referred to her by a colleague whose own family situation had required legal help a few years prior. Margaret was calm, methodical, and had the useful quality of not being surprised by anything. I laid out the full timeline, dates, visits, cancellations, the text message, and she listened without interrupting. When I was done, she said, Ontario does have grandparents' rights legislation. Under Section 21 of the Children's Law Reform Act, a grandparent can apply for an order for access to a grandchild. The courts take the best interests of the child as the primary consideration. She paused. But before we go that route, I'd recommend we document everything comprehensively. The text message you received is actually quite significant. I said, What do you mean? She said, A written demand for payment in exchange for access to a grandchild, particularly when made to a grandparent with no history of harm and a demonstrated positive relationship with the children, is the kind of thing a family court judge notices. I'd save that text. Screenshot it. Send it to yourself by email. Do not delete it. I did exactly that. Margaret also told me something else. Something I hadn't known to look for. She said, You mentioned you helped them financially. Can you give me more detail on that? I told her. When Megan and Brandon had bought their house in 2019, they had been short on the down payment. I had given them $60,000, not as a loan, at the time. I had written a check and told Megan it was a gift. I hadn't wanted her to feel indebted. I hadn't asked for anything in writing. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Did Brandon know it was a gift? Was there any discussion at the time of what it was? I thought back. I said, There was a conversation. Brandon said he'd make it right when they were more settled. I told him not to worry about it. It was for Megan. Margaret said, Would you be willing to recharacterize it as a loan? Because if he said he would repay it, and there was a verbal agreement to that effect, and you have any documentation of the financial transfer, a bank record, A canceled check that creates a legal basis for a demand of repayment. I said, "You're saying I can use the money I gave them." She said, "I'm saying if it was a loan and it wasn't repaid, you have options." I found the bank record. I found 3 emails from 2019 inches which Brandon had referred to the money as the loan and what we owe Bob, and once as Robert's investment in the house. He had used the word loan himself, in writing, 3 times. I brought all of it to Margaret. She prepared a formal demand letter for repayment of $60,000 with accrued interest from the date of transfer. She also prepared a separate document, a formal notice of my intention to apply for grandparent access under the CLRA, if informal resolution could not be reached, citing the text message as evidence of bad faith interference with my relationship with Noah and Claire. I also wrote a letter, not a legal letter, a personal one, to Megan. I wrote it by hand, the way Patricia used to write letters, because I wanted Megan to feel the difference between something typed and sent and something written slowly. I told her I loved her. I told her I was not doing any of this to blow up her marriage or her life. I told her I was doing it because I could see she was not okay, and because her children deserved a grandfather, and because she deserved a father who didn't let her down when things got hard. I sealed it, and I set it aside. Margaret put everything into a large envelope, the legal demand for repayment, the access notice, a formal timeline of visits and cancellations going back 18 months, dated and detailed, a copy of the text from Brandon, and on top of everything, my personal letter to Megan. On a Saturday morning in early May 2023, I drove to their house. I had not called ahead. I knocked on the door. Brandon answered. He saw me, and his face did the calculation. The thing where you watch someone decide what version of themselves to present. He decided on controlled friendliness. "We weren't expecting you." I said, "I know." I held out the envelope. He looked at it. He took it. He opened it. I watched his face as he read the first page. The legal letterhead, Margaret's name, the words demand for repayment, the amount, the interest calculation, which brought the total to just over $68,000. The smile stopped. He flipped to the second document, the access application notice, the copy of his own text. He looked up at me. The color had gone out of his face the way it goes out of the sky before a bad storm. He said, "You can't." I said, "I can. Margaret O'Sea's number is on the first page. You're welcome to have your lawyer contact her." He said, "This is Megan, agreed." I said, "Where is she?" He said, "She's upstairs." I said, "Then I'll wait." Megan came downstairs. She saw Brandon's face. She saw me. She looked at the papers in Brandon's hand. I held out the personal letter. Just to her. She took it. She looked at the envelope for a moment, my handwriting on the front. Just her name, Megan. The way I'd written it on birthday cards and school lunches for her whole life. Something crossed her face. She said, "Give me a minute." She went into the other room. Brandon stood in the hallway looking at me with an expression I didn't have a word for, exactly. It was something between fury and the specific shame of someone who has been caught not by force, but by paperwork. Noah's voice came from upstairs. "Is that Grandpa Bob?" I said, loud enough for him to hear, "It's me, buddy. I'm not going anywhere." After a few minutes, Megan came back. She was holding the letter against her chest. Her eyes were red. She said, "Dad, I already know what's in it." She paused. "I packed a bag this morning. I had to sit down. I hadn't planned for that part." It turned out that Megan had been planning for longer than I'd known. The text Brandon sent me had been the moment she told herself she couldn't keep explaining it away. She had called a friend, a woman from her old job, who she'd quietly stayed in contact with, without Brandon knowing, and had been putting together a plan. The morning I showed up at the door, she had a bag packed in the bedroom closet, had already called that friend, and had been waiting for what she told me later felt like the right moment, but also the courage. I gave her the courage. Or maybe I just showed up when she had already gathered it herself, and just needed to see that someone was on the other side of the door. The kids came downstairs. Noah ran at me, and I caught him. Claire announced that her rabbit's name had been changed to Snowbell Part 2, and this required explanation. Brandon left the house that afternoon. Not gracefully, but he left. In the months that followed, Margaret handled the legal side. Brandon, faced with the repayment demand and the access application, eventually agreed to a negotiated settlement. He repaid $45,000 less than the full amount, but enough to matter. The access issue became moot when Megan filed for separation, but we went through proper channels to make it formal, because Margaret said documentation was worth doing right. Megan and the kids stayed with me in Barrie for 6 weeks while she found her footing. Those 6 weeks were some of the best of my recent life. Noah learned to identify cumulus clouds. Claire decided that Grandpa Bob should have a theme song and composed one, mostly percussion. Megan slept 10 hours a night for the first 2 weeks, which her doctor said was her body doing what it needed to do. She found an apartment in Barrie, 20 minutes from me. Close enough. Not underfoot. Sunday dinners again. Phone calls on the drive home. Texts with pictures of things she thinks are funny. I still have all of them. I don't delete them. Noah asked me once, a few months after everything settled, why I came that day with the envelope. He was doing his dinosaur puzzle on my kitchen floor, not looking up, the way kids ask the questions they've actually been thinking about. I said, because you and your sister deserve a grandfather who shows up. He said, what was in the envelope? I said, some important papers. He thought about this. Then he said, like a superpower? I thought about it too. I said, yeah, buddy. Kind of like that. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to the puzzle. I've thought about what I want to say at the end of this, and I keep coming back to the same few things. The first is for anyone raising children alone after a loss. You are not doing it wrong. The love you put into that is real, and it doesn't disappear just because someone tries to use it against you. I spent 30 years being the best father I could be to Megan, and when Brandon tried to turn that love into a liability, a thing I would pay anything to keep, he miscalculated badly. He thought need was weakness. He was wrong. Need, when it comes from love, is exactly what you fight with. The second is for anyone who sees their adult child changing in a relationship and doesn't know what to do. Pay attention, not with judgment, not with ultimatums. But pay attention the way you pay attention when a building starts showing stress, cracks carefully, steadily, documenting what you see. And when the time comes to act, act with preparation, not just emotion. The third is this. Know what you're owed, not in a bitter way, in a practical way. I gave $60,000 freely because I loved my daughter and I didn't want to make her feel like a transaction. That generosity was right for the moment it was made. But generosity doesn't obligate you to helplessness. When someone turns your love into leverage, you are allowed to pick up every legal and factual tool available to you. That is not hardness. That is how you protect the people worth protecting. And the last thing, grandparents are not optional. The research is clear. The courts increasingly agree. And more importantly, any child who has ever had a grandparent who showed up, who remembered things, who had time, who provided a different kind of love than a parent can give those children know it in their bones. You cannot buy that, and you cannot charge for it. It is simply what it is. Noah got a new dinosaur book for his birthday. He called me to tell me about every dinosaur in it. I sat on my back porch in the evening light with the phone to my ear, listening to a 6-year-old explain the diet of an ankylosaurus, and I thought, this is what I showed up for. This is exactly what I showed up for.